Sapphire Partners is sponsoring once again. And once again, I'll mention that Sapphire is the top recruiting firm in Southern California. I've used Sapphire to hire two of my favorite Southern California people. Sapphire has been in business in Southern California since 2006. They've done over 1,000 searches, so you know that they know everyone. Check them out at sapphirepartners.com or send me a note on LinkedIn. Do that regardless.
Hello and welcome to the LA Venture Podcast. We're David Waxman and Minnie Ingersoll, partners and investors at TenOneTen.
Hey, Aditi.
Hey.
So we're here with Aditi Maliwal. You're one of the newest partners at Upfront. And before Upfront, you were at Google, both in corp dev and as a product manager. And prior to Google, you were at Crosslink Capital, and you led the investments in Chime and BetterUp. Well done.
Those were exciting.
Yeah.
Still are very exciting.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, we had Kara on the podcast and we talked about some of the basics of Upfront being a $400 million fund, sort of $3 to $5 million sweet spot for a check size. But I'm super curious. You've had these great successes, great experience. How did you choose Upfront?
That's actually a very fun question for me to answer. So Kara, as I like to say, was on my personal board of directors before I even was thinking about coming back into venture. So when I was at Crosslink, I met Kara at South by Southwest. And so over time, I'd come to Kara to talk to her about a variety of things, from job opportunities I was looking at, or investments I was looking at, or friends who were starting companies that I wanted to send her way. And it was actually spending time looking at a couple of ideas in the women's health space. And Kara said to me, I've spent quite a bit of time in that ecosystem looking at a couple different companies. If you are interested, instead of building a company in the space, why don't you come and join Upfront and potentially think of funding some of these companies? And she was like, why don't you come down to LA and spend some time with Mark, spend some time with the broader team? Came down, spent time with Mark, spent time with Greg, Kobe, Kevin, Eve, and Michael. And then ultimately, there were a couple of key things that sort of got me hooked onto the Upfront story here. I think the team is truly very transparent in the way that they work and the way that they do things. To play up to the pun, we are very upfront.
But upfront, but transparent sometimes is code word for direct. Or
correct. and the firm is very direct, and people are not sort of hiding behind VC lingo, or people don't expect, and the firm very much functions in that we are truly a fund that works together because we're not afraid of being direct with each other, and whether it's positive, whether it's something that's providing critical feedback, whatever it may be. And so that was something I learned through the process. And then the second thing, which is kind of a strange way to think about venture, but I talked to a bunch of venture funds and I went through a process, and venture funds aren't actually that innovative. We invest in innovation, but they aren't actually quite as innovative. And Mark and Kara, Greg, Eve, Kobe, Michael, Kevin are all really part of this very innovative story here, where, for example, partner meetings used to run a certain way and ran a certain way for 12 years. And a couple people pushed back and were like, this is really not the way that is most effective. We should be spending more time doing some of looking at pipeline, or we should spend less time on pipeline, more time on problem childs or whatever it may be. And we've iterated on what our partner meeting looks like a whole bunch of times. And then we've also iterated on a variety of different processes internally, which I think was something that I learned and saw through the process, which was just incredibly different from every fund that I spent time with. And I think that's truly led by Mark.
How is your process? Is your process for decision-making on where to put your investments changed?
So I would say that the way we even go through the process is we will tell an entrepreneur right in the beginning kind of where our heads at. When I used to work in venture, I think I was also in a position where I'd sort of take a meeting and then be like, great, I'll come back to you, after we've synced up as a team. Now, and I've seen this sort of with some of our other partners, is people will be a lot more open to giving feedback in the meeting itself and sort of having a real conversation around, hey, these are the areas that I'm kind of stuck on, or these are the areas I know my partnership is not going to get excited about. And then kind of walking them through what our process even looks like as a firm. I'm going to walk you through my steps today in this meeting as to what I'm going to do, and then come to a decision by this date, which I think is something, laying that out well in advance is, I would assume, helpful for an entrepreneur.
Yeah, being able to say we'll come to a decision by a date is a strong statement.
Yeah, and unusual.
Yeah.
I'm I'm curious about this question of innovation because, working even at our fund, I feel like it's the least tech company I've worked at. What do you think lies ahead in terms of innovation for VC? Is there something you can see that would be like a step function change, or is it changes like how you run your meeting and how the process is handled?
Yeah, I mean, having worked at Google, I'll tell you, I mean, people talk about GV a lot, obviously, and people talk about a lot of funds now starting to use data science for things like sourcing. And then, hiring an entire engineering team and having like people mining or scraping the internet for signals that are then going to tell you where people are performing. I think that's obviously like one side of it. And there are folks who are investing in that. I think other areas of innovation that lie within venture is, I mean, this is a people-run business. We're not going to see the same prototypical successful investor with the exact same background. And I see this a lot at Upfront, in that all of us, I think, have spent some time operating. And obviously we have a few partners who are founders, but we also have some partners who've only ever invested. And that's, I think, the appreciation that people can come from different backgrounds. So that's where I believe venture capital has to spend a lot of time thinking about.
And right now you guys are an 8-person fund?
Yes. Or eight partners.
8 partners, that's what I meant. And so for finding those pockets of innovation, I think that was really well said. Do you need one person to be the champion? Can you share more about how that works?
Yeah. So I think the way that we actually go about some of our decisions is every partner at Upfront, all 8 of us are empowered to make our own decisions, which is very much, if I got very, very excited about one particular deal, I would run point on sort of making sure I understand my company that I'm excited about. I understand the thesis. I've potentially built some muscle in terms of understanding that market. And then in a way, I'm coming into the partnership, educating my partnership, which I think traditional funds are kind of like, stacked in a way. It's like you have your associate, your principal, your partner, your managing director, and then you go to IC. That's really not the way we work. We have 2 associates at Upfront, and they kind of have the opportunity if they want to jump in on a deal, or if there's something that I think Josh or Alice might be particularly well suited to, I'll say like, hey, I'd love to bring Josh into this. And if Josh is interested, Josh can decide. And then oftentimes Josh will bring opportunities to me as well. And so we get to work together there.
It's nice also that Upfront has promoted a couple of its principals to partner, which is pretty, you don't see it all the time, or not at every firm.
But also only 2 associates and 8 partners is I hadn't thought about it that clearly.
Totally. It's the upside down pyramid. And I think that inverted pyramid is sort of functionally empowering you, but also reminding you like you're
responsible.
You're responsible. You're leading this.
Can we go back a little bit even before that? You're the only person I've ever met who has a personal board of directors. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. So I think people don't officially formalize it. And so I've probably been one of the first few people who's decided to formalize it. My personal board of directors includes Kara. And then there are 2 others who are on my personal board of directors. And one is obviously a family member. My father. He's also actually an investor. He runs a private equity fund in India. And the other person is actually someone who's a close mentor and has nothing to do with my professional world, and is somebody that I go to for sort of seeking guidance on the transitions, especially. I think the transitions are always times when we are a lot more introspective. I think when we're in it, we're doing the job. It's harder to be as introspective.
When it's going well.
Yes.
When it's not going well, there's times for introspection.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask a little bit about how your previous experience has informed your current themes you're looking at in your current work?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was at Crosslink investing earlier on, I invested in BetterUp and Chime amongst a couple other companies. And that sort of got me pretty excited, I think, in the categories of fintech, and people call it future of work, but I think of it around employee engagement, employee retention, and thinking stronger around like how to make somebody in the workplace a better worker, or empower them to be more efficient. And so I do spend time in those categories. Those are interesting to me today. And actually carrying those on, when I went into Google, I ended up actually spending within corp dev and then in product, spending time on payments specifically as well. That was definitely that was a category that sort of translated through.
And so tell me just what you were doing at corp dev. So
Yeah.
mostly corp dev is doing acquisitions.
Yes. So the way corp dev works is it was mostly doing acquisitions. We have yet to do an M. We mostly do A's.
Yeah.
And we do uniquely make a few strategic investments off balance sheet. So this is different to GV, capital G. And I got to work on actually some of those when I was there as well. And so what Corp Dev was doing and what I specifically was doing is sort of being the eyes and ears. So spending a lot of time outward facing, finding new themes, new opportunities, investment areas, either product investment or us acquiring a company in the space. So, we looked at things like what is the future of news? Where is AR going? How do we think more about social? Social is something Google didn't necessarily focus on.
And corp dev would be having these thoughts about what's the future of news.
Yes.
And then bringing it back to the executive team or?
Yeah. Most executives obviously see variety of different companies that will come through their product managers. As product managers spend a lot of time thinking about what the competition looks like in the ecosystem. But when you have corp dev, which is usually the eyes and ears for the company, out there kind of meeting with folks, you also get an indication of how these businesses are doing, which I think is differentiated.
And then how did you interact with like Google Ventures?
The nice thing is we're all in Mountain View. We do have everyone, corp dev, GV, and capital G.
The nice thing.
Yeah.
Depending on where you live.
Totally. Yeah. So everyone had a space in Mountain View. We personally, the way that Google Corp Dev interacted is we had really good relationships with GV and Capital G. Capital G is run by David Lowy, who was formerly the head of Corp Dev at Google, and so has a very strong relationship with the actual team itself.
How did you decide between those two paths, between investing in M&A?
To be clear, we did not do very many investments. Our predominant predominantly we spent time acquiring businesses and a lot of talent too, obviously. But I think the decision really came to, is this business that we are looking to potentially acquire or invest a direct would it be directly beneficial to a specific product area? Is it enhancing a product area or taking us into a different line that product area might be exploring in the future?
And just for practical advice, how do you get to a PM at Google?
Good question.
Or even figure out who to go to?
I think most people are pretty open on LinkedIn. I mean, I still view LinkedIn as like one of the best resources. And then I would say a lot of PMs are actually also angel investors and have angel list profiles. You can also just email me and I can find an into some different product area.
Great. Okay, so you were at Corp Dev, you were doing the A's. And why did you move to being a PM?
I just felt you spend a lot of time being the eyes and ears of the business, but I wasn't spending time in the business. And actually, I'm from Singapore. So I grew up in Southeast Asia. I grew up between India, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Originally from India, but spent my most formative years in Singapore. And so there's a team within Google called the Next Billion Users team. And so I joined to be a product manager on the Next Billion Users team. So what we call the next billion user markets were India, Brazil, China, Indonesia, amongst others. So to have the opportunity, one, to spend more time in the ecosystem that I grew up in, and then building a product for them, I just thought was incredibly unique. And I got to be really part of the core working business. And so that was why I wanted to be a PM.
Did you run this past the board?
I did. I actually did run it past the board. The personal board of directors. I know. I actually did run it past the board. And a few board members, not naming which ones, pushed back and said, do you really want to be a product manager? You're not going to spend any more time talking to, startups and spending time with founders. You're actually going to spend a lot of time talking to users and spending a ton of time what was the best part about being a PM was sort of running the user research trips and like getting to go into the market and see testing features with users and kind of getting a very immediate sense of feedback, which by the way is is such a different feeling from venture capital when you could kind of not see feedback on businesses that you invest in for a long time, because these feedback loops are so much longer.
Yeah. And like before I move off Google, you have talked some about how Google has really informed your current investment thesis or one of your theses of sort of things being built by Google being things you want to invest in. Tell me more about how Google plays in.
Yeah. So I think of Google as this incredible ecosystem. It's obviously over 100,000 person company now, but and they have physical space, they own land. We have our cafeterias and all that things. But Google itself is actually a builder of incredible software that is built for Googlers. So Googlers will spend a lot of time using internal tools to sort of make their days more efficient or make their or to find things, whether it's internal search, whether it's obviously we have Hangouts and a variety of other products like that. I have been thinking more about the internal, I sort of made a list of every single internal tool that I used when I was at Google, and then kind of broke it down into which category of the user's workflow it falls into and whether there are interesting businesses in each of those categories. So sort of like, I would say breaking apart what I think was a very cohesive machine into if they ever thought about selling any of that product to other companies or other businesses, they could actually be very profitable standalone companies, but that's not what Google does. And Google builds a lot for the 100,000 person company.
Got it. So, so this is more like companies that are addressing this need. Google's too proud. Google likes to build everything itself. But if there were a company that were building better, MoMA is the Google internal search tool.
Sure.
Someone building something like that.
Yep. So those are kind of categories, and that kind of goes into this like broader thesis of, as we call it, future of work.
I'd love to hear a little bit. FinTech has had a really good week this week, and whenever this airs, Credit Karma just got bought for $7 billion, and you had some FinTech focus.
Yes.
Tell us about your investment in Chime and how you thought about that and where that might have moved to today.
Yeah. I mean, Chime was an incredible opportunity. It was a very early company when we looked at it. We at Crosslink, I worked very closely with a partner, Jim Foy, and we led their Series A. And at the time, neobanks weren't a thing. People were not talking about neobanks. The term neobank, I don't even think existed. We spent a lot of time thinking about, I remember Jim and I spending time in a conference room talking about how miserable my Bank of America app experience was, and how withdrawing cash was sort of the easiest thing that I could do with them. And really there was not very much else that was like created on the product itself. And, nothing against Bank of America, because the app has definitely increasingly improved since then. But I think we spent a lot of time talking about that. And in turn, we spent a lot of time thinking about customer acquisition. We spent a lot of time thinking about how Chime would go out and build their consumer base. And funnily enough, when Chime was starting off, they were focusing on a similar millennial demographic. But one of Chime's early investors also gave them access to Dr. Phil. And so they were spending a lot of time advertising. They spent some marketing dollars on advertising with Dr. Phil. And so that gave them access to a different audience. And so, for a while, Chime kind of had these two very different target user groups. And when we were making the investment, I remember Jim and I talking a lot about like moms in the Midwest and how they could potentially be real Chime sticky users. What ended up happening, and I think about this a lot as then I went on to think about this when I was being a PM, is that oftentimes like free channels of marketing are ones that you sort of need to really think about whether you take them, and sometimes they can kind of lead you down a path which doesn't necessarily end up being quite so fruitful, or in some cases you just realize it's not the right demographic for your product. So anyway, we ended up making that investment in Chime then, and Jim and I worked very closely with Chris and Ryan on that. And the most interesting thing I think about Chime is, I don't know, I like to do this where I'll go on Glassdoor and sort of look at employee reviews of some of the companies that I invested in, BetterUp being one and Chime being the other. And Chime has some of the most positive employee reviews, and they have such incredible employee engagement and retention, and there are almost no negative reviews online on Glassdoor on Chime. And I just think that just gives me so much happiness in the business and the culture.
You've done some great investments. Like, what are those tools? So looking on Glassdoor, I think, is a great one, but like, how do you just do better, almost like basic analyst work?
So I actually love using App Annie, for example. Like, I think App Annie truly gives me some incredibly helpful data in terms of traffic. And I think traffic can be, so I'll give you an example, Wish.com. Yeah. So Wish.com, their app was not growing very fast. It was from about 2014 to 2016, mid 2017, stayed relatively stagnant. 2017 in App Annie, you suddenly see this uptick. And it's kind of crazy that, like, what's going on? Suddenly App Annie is like showing me that this company is starting to do like really, really well. They've then gone on to like go and reduce their shipping time. They've also maybe hit their stride on a user demographic. Like, you're starting to think like, hey, who was Wish.com actually built for? It turned out that women between the age of 15 and 18 turned out to be a very profitable demographic for them. And that's how they focus. So I spend a lot of time on basic analytic tools. So like, I do use App Annie. It's very traditional. I use SimilarWeb. Sounds weird, but I do use them. I also use Alexa, like Alexa, the web analytics product. And then the other thing, Glassdoor is great. Like, Glassdoor is sort of your hacky way to figure out, are people happy there? Yeah. If people aren't happy, you probably have a bigger fundamental issue than like, I can't raise $10 million in my Series A. And then I think that you can also go on, funnily enough, some companies have Yelp reviews. So they actually have like Yelp listings, and then you can go look at those things. So I look at a lot of inside voices. Like, I really want to hear the voice of the person in there. And then I'm not at all I'm very shameless, I'll put it this way, and we'll LinkedIn message employees all the time and just be like, hey, I'd love to chat with you if you have a few minutes.
Interesting.
As I'm reviewing the company.
Interesting.
So you talked about getting to know a space where you're investing, and we all know how fun that is to climb the steep learning curve. How do you figure out, where do you start, and how do you figure out, for example, the competitive landscape, which can sometimes have hidden things all around in it?
So if I start very simply, keyword search is pretty phenomenal. Thank God for that.
It's true. Yeah. How many times have people not mentioned a competitor that appears at the top of the stack in Google?
Exactly. So keyword search really does work. You know, it's interesting. Twitter has recently been a very interesting source for competitive analysis. So I've been spending time looking at enterprise banking, for example, banks or sort of infrastructure products that are building for enterprises. And I started doing a search on Twitter for this, and you will find that there are people who are talking about it, and you can spend time reaching out to them. And everyone, by the way, everybody does think of themselves as an expert on Twitter, apparently.
How about like BetterUp? BetterUp is interesting to me because right now it feels very crowded. Like, there's actually, I don't totally know what it's sort of coaching.
Yes.
Coaching for employees, right? That space seems so crowded, and yet I know you're focused on employees, what did you call it?
Engagement,
future of work.
retention.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So how now do you sort out the many different people in this space?
Yeah. So I think of BetterUp really as like one of the, I do think of them as sort of the first mover in the space. They kind of like, people have always had L&D departments. Like, their large organizations have had L&D business units. And I think BetterUp, especially, and like Alexi and Eddie spent a lot of time realizing that, or didn't spend that much time realizing, they just saw it pretty much right there, which was, this is not actually enabled by technology, and like, we need to find a way to truly enable this and also increase accessibility. So I think a lot of times learning and development was very much spent on for the high performer or the executive team. But when in reality, at larger businesses, you have people who are growing up the ranks and you want to empower them the right way. So I think BetterUp really did create a category that was not tech enabled at the time. That being said, I think, yes, you're right. There are a lot of people trying to go after that. Once you see the success of one company, you're kind of like, if I were a founder, I would say like, hey, that seemed like an interesting category. There's not necessarily going to be a winner takes all. Like, why don't I try to build something similar? So I think like the way for me now to sort of find the signal through the noise is I think of the employee as the center of every business. Are there ways that you incentivize them through perks? Are there ways that you sort of make processes in their lives more efficient? Like, are they shipping code constantly? If they're shipping code, can they do it faster? Can they do it? Are there better communication tools? So there are many, I think of even future of work, and I think of even like the employee as the center, as like this broader theme, but every day and every part of my working day has different ways by which it can be made more efficient.
Has your personal board or your actual, parents or anything, what has Kara told you? What's been some advice that's really stood out for you?
So it's interesting. Actually, Mark and Greg, two of my other partners, actually gave me this advice right when I joined, which was go slow. I think there's a tendency right when you get into venture or get back into venture, which is guns blazing. I have no boards. Like, I have a lot of space. I have a lot of time. I'm going to write 17 checks in the next 7 years or whatever. Not even like in the next 5 years, make it crazier. I don't know. They've sort of said to me, both gave me advice from a different perspective and kind of both came to the conclusion that like going slow helps you build that muscle, which is the filter muscle. Mm-hmm. And so that was like a piece of advice that like truly stuck out to me. And then something actually Eve said to me, he was like, go with your gut. Like, you can only trust, the only thing you can trust is yourself in this process. And like, obviously we've taken a bet on you in the same way that you will take a bet on the founders you go and back. But he was like, your gut instinct has led you to some good investments and has led you to some mediocre investments. However, there have been the only thing that you had in those moments were your gut instinct. Obviously information, let's not forget that. But those are two things that I still think about every single day as I'm evaluating a company, whether I'm like, okay, is this somebody I want to spend time with?
I like it. One more just before we wrap up. I have no data on this. I share anecdotally in LA, the women in venture have this disproportionate, have been badass athletes. And you were the captain of your squash team, D1 Stanford squash team, right?
Yeah. I mean, being an athlete has only made me better and I think like more focused on my job. I don't know what it's like not to be an athlete. So let me put it in context that I have always had schedules. I've always had routines. I've always had discipline in terms of like, there is a goal and we're working towards the goal. I think the one thing about being an athlete is we always knew like we wanted to go to nationals and make sure we win at nationals, and we'd have like certain positions that we wanted to play or certain like positions we wanted to end at. I think the big thing or one of the big takeaways from being an athlete there is actually creating mini goals is incredibly important in the journey and like these mini milestones, and then celebrating them. I think those are two things that like that I really like learned from being an athlete, and that's like what I incorporate in my daily life today.
Oh, that's lovely. Do you have any mini goals right now to share?
Well, one mini goal that has sort of like come up recently is we're establishing our office in San Francisco, and we're sort of establishing our presence up there. That's I kind of set up the office a couple months ago, and so one of the mini goals is making sure that people know that we have a presence there, kind of getting that out there in the ecosystem, and making sure that entrepreneurs have a place to come and work out of too, that are within our ecosystem or sort of extensions of. And so if you have founders who want to come and work in our space, like more than welcome to. It's just me up there right now.
I love it. LA is expanding to San Francisco. Take that.
Long SF.
Long LASF.
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aditi. Great to have you.
Thank you.